Compared to the flow of news over the last few days coming from the fighting in Avdeyevka, the last 24 hours appear slightly calmer, though I have to say that in any other period of the special military operation, or indeed in any other recent conflict that I can think of, even the last 24 hours have seen news which is pretty dramatic by any sensible measure. The first thing to say is that this morning the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the coke plant near Avdeyevka has passed under the full control of the Russian military. The report is very short. The Center Group of Forces developing the offensive took full control of the coke plant in Avdeyevka direction. Russian flags were hoisted on the administrative buildings of the plant. Units of the Ukrainian military continued their disorderly retreat. The Russian armed forces hit enemy strongholds with artillery and aviation fire. The Center Group of Forces continues active operations. And that report was published early this morning at 7 a.m. Moscow time, and it's accompanied by a video, drone footage of the coke plant taken from a reasonably high altitude, showing heavy explosions in the coke plant. But anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry says that the Russians have taken full control of the coke plant. In other words, all those Azov fighters who had hidden in the bunkers and underground facilities of the coke plant took what I have to say I consider to be the rational decision, which is instead of allowing themselves to become completely surrounded, they withdrew. Though I ought to say they will have withdrawn into a storm, because it is clear that the Russian Air Force and the Russian artillery are still active, indeed are as active as ever, north of the coke plant as elsewhere. And it's highly likely that a proportion of these Ukrainian troops who were withdrawing from the coke plant will have been caught in the open during the night and will have been killed or wounded as well. So anyway, one way or the other, the coke plant is now under Russian control. Now, I ought to say that there are people who don't share the same view as me about the wisdom of withdrawing from the coke plant. One is Julian Röpke, the journalist of BITCHUTE, who has been covering the war. He seems extremely frustrated and angry that the Ukrainians have abandoned the coke plant. I'm not going to give very much weight to him. A different view from somebody I take a great deal more seriously and who has provided exemplary coverage of the situation in Avdeyevka as in other previous battles in Ukraine. Anyway, an alternative view has been provided by Valterson. Valterson is surprised that the Ukrainians surrendered the coke plant so quickly. He thinks that it would have been an important defense position and one which would have made the retreat from Avdeyevka more organized. I think if this had been a more structured withdrawal, he would obviously have been right. But given the unfolding chaos, which still continues, by the way, all around Avdeyevka, I think that it would have made little sense to try to hold on to the coke plant. It's clear to me that Ukrainian defenses in and around Avdeyevka have, to all intents and purposes, collapsed. And given that that is the case, there really was no choice on the part of the soldiers there but to withdraw, though one would be curious to know whether the authorities in Kiev countenance this withdrawal. Anyway, note the other point made by the Russian Defense Ministry that center group of forces, that's to say the forces under General Mordvichev's command, they continue their military operations. They continue their offensive. There's no question this time, as there was after the battles of Mariupol and Bakhmut, of the Russians giving themselves a pause. They still continue, as they have done previously, with their advances, and I presume that will remain the case, at least for the time being. President Putin, by the way, has now formally congratulated the various Russian military units that participated in the fighting in Avdeyevka. We have a list of them. The 30th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade of the Second Army, the 35th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, the 55th Separate Mountain Motor Rifle Brigade, the 74th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade of the 41st Army, the 1st Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, the 9th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, the 114th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, the 1454th Motor Rifle Regiment, the 10th Tank Regiment of the 1st Army Corps, the 6th Tank Regiment, the 80th Tank Regiment, and the 239th Tank Regiment of the 9th Tank Division, and the Veterans Volunteer Brigade. He has not mentioned, so far, the critical contribution of the Rosgvardia operation, whose troops were also participating in the fighting in Avdeyevka. I suspect that they will be separately mentioned in a later report. I should say that one of the units of the Rosgvardia organization that participated in the fighting, in fact, the key unit, was, to my understanding, an assault unit which is made up of former Wagner fighters. They were the same people who fought in Bakhmut, and I have no doubt that one of the reasons why this operation in Avdeyevka was conducted so fast is precisely because the Wagner fighters have been able to advise, inform, educate the rest of the Russian army, the Russian armed forces, in the way in which street fighting, like the fighting that was conducted in Avdeyevka, how that kind of fighting should be conducted. So we'll probably see, most probably from Putin himself, congratulations extended to these Rosgvardia units. This particular congratulation was extended to the units of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, it's not only in the coke plant that the Russians remain on the attack. They've been pressing westwards towards this village of Lastochkino. There are confusing reports about what has happened with Lastochkino. Last night, there were reports that Lastochkino had been stormed and captured by the Russian army. Other reports, discussed by Dima at the Military Summary Channel this morning, spoke about Lastochkino being in the grey zone, that the Ukrainians had withdrawn, but that the Russians had not occupied this village. There's a third view, which is being provided by Riba, though I should say I'm not absolutely sure of how up-to-date this report from Riba is. Anyway, Riba says that the Ukrainians still hold Lastochkino, that there are still Ukrainian troops occupying this village. But if I've understood his rather confusing report correctly, the only reason why the Ukrainian troops are still in Lastochkino is because, in effect, they've been cut off. The Russian bombing of the roads to the west of Lastochkino and the surrounding fields has been so severe that the Ukrainian troops in Lastochkino have essentially realized that trying to retreat along these roads or along these fields is suicidal, and as a result they've taken the decision to remain in place. Well, which of these reports is true? I have no idea, but suffice to say that so far the Russian Defense Ministry is not reporting that Lastochkino has been captured, and I assume that means that the Russians have not, in fact, captured Lastochkino, though it is likely that this is only a matter of time. There are a lot of other things to say about the Battle of Avdeyevka, but perhaps the most important of these is an absolutely harrowing report that I received this morning from, again, a very informed source. He has given me a number for the number of Ukrainian troops who've supposedly killed and whose bodies lie in Avdeyevka. I'm not going to cite this number. Again, I worry that doing so might reveal information about the source, because I suspect that this number is very restricted information. But in any event, it is horrendous. It seems that the Russians, that the stench of rotting bodies lies all over Avdeyevka and is becoming overwhelming, and that the Russians are having to organize special details to try to find all of these soldiers and to bring them together and to try to clear Avdeyevka of all of these bodies. The same source has also given me a figure for the total number of Ukrainian troops who have been captured in Avdeyevka. This is not troops who have been captured over the last couple of days, but as I understand it, over the course of the last few weeks, as the defences in Avdeyevka began to crumble. And I should say that there were reports of Ukrainian prisoners being taken several weeks ago, at the time when the Russians overran the fortification known as the Tsar's Hunting Lodge, and no doubt there were more prisoners taken in the air defense base and the Zaporizhzhia complex and the filtration plant and all of those other outlying positions. And no doubt there were prisoners taken in Avdeyevka itself when the Russians broke in. Anyway, again, he's given me a number which I find plausible. And once again, I'm afraid I am not going to reveal that number, because doing so might reveal the source, but it is at the very highest end of some of the numbers that have been floating around. The number of dead in Avdeyevka, I will simply say this, is higher. Well, there we are. An absolute disaster in Avdeyevka, a disaster for the Ukrainian army. And I should say that there are reports that President Zelenskyy is absolutely furious about what has happened. He's very angry that Avdeyevka collapsed whilst the Munich Security Conference was underway. He feels that he has been embarrassed and has lost face as a result. He is furious, it seems, first and foremost with the troops of the 3rd Assault Brigade, who disobeyed orders to relieve Avdeyevka and refused to come to the rescue of the soldiers there and disobeyed the command to stabilize the situation and command the Russians, rather to contain the Russians. And there are reports that President Zelenskyy has also expressed great dissatisfaction with General Syrskyi and his bungled command of the situation in Avdeyevka, and that he is now apparently pressing for an investigation and potential prosecution of the various officers who were involved in the Avdeyevka operation, both those officers of the 3rd Assault Brigade who refused to come to the rescue of Avdeyevka, and other Ukrainian officers who might have negotiated terms of surrender for Ukrainian troops who had become cut off. Now, I'm going to say straight away, if President Zelenskyy is unwise enough to press forward with this, with investigations and prosecutions of this kind, especially if he takes on the 3rd Assault Brigade, which, to be frank, has never liked him. We all know that it's essentially the Azov Brigade, and the men who make it up have very, very strong ideological views, which would not be of a sort that would make them sympathetic to President Zelenskyy. Anyway, I think that if President Zelenskyy presses ahead with this kind of investigation and prosecutions and court-martials and all of that kind of thing, not only will he demoralize the Ukrainian armed forces even more, but he's likely to antagonize very, very powerful people in Ukraine with guns, and I think that might prove, shall we say, risky for him. I'm being very careful once more, obviously, in my choice of words. But I will notice, just finishing on the topic of Zelenskyy, that even as he was visiting the Munich Security Conference, meeting people there, speaking to people, trying to rally European support, one of his major critics in Ukraine, Mayor Klitschko of Kiev, was also in Germany attending the Munich Security Conference. And I can't help but think that his primary purpose was to try to undermine Zelenskyy, which of course Klitschko especially, specifically, would be in a strong position to do with this audience, given that he, Klitschko, has had a long history of close connections with Germany, as, by the way, does his brother, who is a boxer, just as Klitschko himself used to be. Anyway, that's all something to discuss further. Going back to the 3rd Assault Brigade, the Russian Defense Ministry has also now published video footage of a big missile strike on Selidove. This is the place where we were getting all those reports some days ago that the Russians had carried out a huge strike upon it, and that hundreds of men, perhaps even thousands of men, had been killed or wounded over the course of this strike. The Russian Defense Ministry remained silent about it. I said that obviously opened up questions about whether the strike on Selidove had really happened. But I also said that given that the Russian Defense Ministry appeared to be following a policy of silence in connection with every aspect of the Avdeyevka operation, that probably was one reason why the Russian Defense Ministry was not providing information or confirmation that the strike on Selidove had taken place. Well, the Avdeyevka operation is now all but complete. The Russian Defense Ministry is now being open about it, and they have now published footage of the missile strike on Selidove, and we can now definitely say that it did take place, though again, the exact number of Ukrainian casualties has not been verified. I suspect that at some point over the next few days, we will probably get a fuller report from the Russians about what happened in Avdeyevka. That will provide us with more complete, up-to-date casualty figures. As I said, I suspect that the figure I've been given privately is the correct one. We'll know soon enough. And one way or the other, we'll probably get estimates of the casualties, the Ukrainian casualties in Selidove, and as I say, one way or the other, we'll get a more complete sense of what happened over the course of this really extraordinary military operation. There is one point about the Battle of Avdeyevka I do want to make, and it touches on a point I have made many times, and it concerns once again Western news management about the Battle of Avdeyevka. I've been seeing some fantastic claims that the Russians lost 17,000 men killed in trying to capture Avdeyevka. There is absolutely no corroboration or evidence of this at all. Mediazona provides us with what seem to me verifiable and reports of Russian casualties. I've discussed the Mediazona project many times, which is of course conducted with the BBC, alongside the BBC. They continue to show Russian casualties, the data on Russian casualties for January and February, as relatively low. There have been two big spikes in terms of Russian casualties over the course of the war. The first was in the opening weeks of the conflict in February, March 2022. The second was during the Battle of Bakhmut. Russian losses did increase, totals of aggregates of Russian losses did increase in October, right at the start of the Battle of Avdeyevka, the most difficult part for the Russians of the battle. But since then they've fallen back again. Most probably this is a figure that will be increased later, because presumably there are still reports, open source reports of Russian losses, of funerals and such things from the fighting in Avdeyevka that haven't yet reached Mediazona. But it doesn't seem as if the losses, Russian losses in Avdeyevka overall, have been especially heavy. We would have had reports, more detailed reports, if they were. And Walterson, who is apparently in contact with some Russian soldiers who have actually been fighting in Avdeyevka, he says that, as I understand it, that these soldiers are essentially telling him the same thing. It was a tough, well-fought battle, but Russian losses were not especially high. And it really does no one any help to pretend otherwise. I've seen more reports this morning, for example, that the Ukrainians claim to have shot down more Russian fighter jets over Avdeyevka. Again, I'm going to say straight away, I think that these reports almost certainly are wrong, are untrue. Ukrainian claims about Russian aircraft losses have, it seems to me, proved to be especially unreliable over the last few weeks, and I would discount them. The other thing I want to say about Western media coverage of Avdeyevka, the Battle of Avdeyevka, is something that every single Western report about this battle, which I read so far, they all say, without variation, and which extraordinarily some pro-Russian reports are also saying, and that is that Avdeyevka is the first major Russian victory since the fall of Bakhmut. This is wrong. This is entirely wrong. And it comes back to this point, which I've made many times, which is about the way in which the facts about the defeat of Ukraine's summer offensive continue to be misrepresented. The summer offensive, Ukraine's summer offensive, did not fail. It was defeated. It was defeated by the Russian army. The mines which the Ukrainian tanks got caught up in, the minefields, didn't just lay themselves. The fortifications, which proved so impregnable, didn't just appear. They're not part of the landscape. The Russian soldiers who operated those defenses, they weren't, part of the landscape as well. Ukraine conducted a massive offensive over the course of the summer, and it was comprehensively defeated by the Russian army. By any objective measure, the Russians gained a major victory in the summer, a victory which led precisely to this further victory in Avdeyevka that we are seeing now against a Ukrainian army which has been perhaps mortally wounded as a result of that tremendous defeat that it suffered over the course of the summer fighting. And, of course, the summer offensive was not the last victory that the Russians achieved since the fall of Avdeyevka, since the fall of Bakhmut and before the Battle of Avdeyevka. The Russians, a few weeks ago, also captured Marinka, and as discussed, they are in the process of capturing further villages around Marinka, and that might prove to be an important and serious operation as well. So, again, it does no favours either to Ukraine or to Western understanding of this war to continue to speak about that Ukrainian offensive of the summer as merely having failed, rather than acknowledge the truth that this was a Ukrainian defeat and a major Russian victory. Anyway, just saying those things. So what happens next? Well, as I said, the Army Group Center, we're being told by the Russian Defense Ministry, is continuing its offensive, so there's no slackening of offensive pressure there. As I discussed yesterday, the Russians have begun some kind of further offensive in Zaporizhzhia, and there's lots of confusing reports and claims about the progress of this offensive. For the record, I think the most plausible report is from Riba. He claims that the Russians have now broken into the village of Rabotino, not a significant or big place in itself, as I discussed many times during the fighting there last summer. Anyway, that they've broken into Rabotino, and that fighting is now going on in the central part of this village. And anyway, one way or the other, if you follow Rybar's report, which I tend to do, then it looks as if the Russians are well on the way to storming this particular village. They're also apparently advancing westwards from Verbovoye, and they seem well on the way to clearing all the higher ground, all those parts of the higher ground that the Ukrainians, with immense difficulty, were able to capture over the period of the summer offensive, leaving any Ukrainian troops still occupying any part of Bradley Square, the area between Rabotino and Verbovoye, still in the lowlands. Now, here again, I'm going to express my own puzzlement. I am not sure why the Ukrainians are here at all, why they're trying to hold on to buildings, shattered buildings in Rabotino. I've seen film of what Rabotino looks like now. And again, it is a shattered landscape. I mean, I didn't see a single building in Rabotino in this film that looked like it was still standing. So I don't understand why the Ukrainians want to cling on to Rabotino. I don't understand why they want to maintain their positions in Bradley Square or near Verbovoye at all. I would have thought that this is an undefendable salient. The Russians are on three sides. They have enormous superiority in men and machines. They have a very, very powerful air force. There is at least a possibility of Ukrainian troops in Bradley Square being cut off if the Russians were to concentrate their minds on doing it. I would have thought that long before the Russians began this operation, once it became clear that the summer offensive, the Zaporizhzhia offensive, had been defeated, not just failed, they would have withdrawn from this useless ground and retreated to more defendable positions, say around the town of Orechov. Well, as is invariably the case, they didn't. Apparently they decided to make a defense of this area. There's even reports that they're sending reserves, such reserves as they still have, maybe some of these exhausted units that tried and failed to stem the advance in Avdeyevka, that they're going to be sent all the way back to this area, Bradley Square, try to hold back the Russian advance. Again, I can see no military logic in this. Presumably, it's difficult for the Ukrainians to admit that all this territory, won at such enormous cost over the course of the summer, has to be abandoned. But surely this is, again, the logical and rational decision. If this ground is useless to Ukraine, and as far as I can see, it is, why is it sacrificing men and scarce equipment trying to cling on to it? I will say this, if the Russians fully consolidate control of Rabotino, which they will at some point, probably in the next few days, and all the surrounding heights, I suspect that the logic of this is going to become clear to more and more Ukrainian commanders, even to Ukrainian commanders like General Syrskyi and General Tarnavsky, and perhaps they will finally make the only sane decision that I can see, which is to pull back from Bradley Square, undefendable as it is, and to focus instead on trying to defend Orekhov. And of course, we're getting reports of further Russian advances in other places. It's said that the Russians have concentrated a large force of men in the Marinka area, and it could be the case that they're planning some big offensive there. It would be a logical thing to do. Once Novomikhailovka and Georgievka and Pobeda, these villages near Marinka, have been cleared, it will be logical for the Russians to press on to capture places like Krasnogorovka, the other Krasnogorovka, north of Marinka and south of Avdeyevka, to try and capture that place. And another fortified village that goes by the strange name of New York. Yes, it is apparently named after the American city. Anyway, to capture that place as well. And to move on and capture Kurakhovo to the west, a town which is supposed to be the last remaining point from which the Ukrainians can send supplies to Vuhledar, their forces in Vuhledar, if all of the other supply lines are cut off, as they presumably soon will be, and from which, by the way, the Ukrainians continue to shell Donetsk city. It's been claimed by various people that with the fall of Avdeyevka, Donetsk city is now fully out of range of the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian artillery. That is unfortunately not the case. There are still places from which the Ukrainians can shell Donetsk city. Kurakhovo is one. But anyway, it's plausible that the Russians will want to push on towards Kurakhovo, which not only probably will put Avdeyevka beyond the range of conventional artillery, but which will also likely collapse Ukrainian defenses in southern Donetsk and in Vuhledar. So that's plausible, and, well, there's reports that the Russians are now fighting either within Ivanivska or around Ivanivska, but anyway, they seem to be pressing heavily in Ivanivska and in the Bakhmut area, and it's plausible that there will be a Russian push towards Chasov Yar before very long. And there's also claims that the biggest concentration of Russian troops of all is in the north, in the area around Kupiansk and Liman, supposedly up to 100,000 men gathering there. Huge force by the standards of this conflict. Bigger, I think, than the force with which Ukraine began the first part of its summer offensive in Zaporizhzhia. Anyway, a huge force by the standards of this conflict, and one which, if it really exists, it lends credence to the theory that, in fact, it is in the north, around Kupiansk, Izium, Slavyansk, and perhaps even further north towards Kharkiv, with perhaps advances across the Russian border into Kharkiv region as well, that it is in the north that the big Russian blow is going to fall. The most interesting question for me, the one that we're going to have to wait to see the answer to, is whether, as most people suppose, the Russians will stop offensive operations, their advances, during the period of the spring Rasputitsa, which apparently begins at the end of February and goes on throughout March. The general consensus is that they will, but the Russians, of course, conducted offensive operations in October, during the autumn at Rasputitsa, and it tends to get forgotten that the start of the special military operation was at the end of February 2022 and continued throughout March, which is of course also the time of the Rasputitsa. Though it should be said that at that time the Russians were basically sending big armored columns down the main roads, and anyway the whole operation was conducted in a very different way from the way that it is now. But anyway, one way or the other, I personally would not be surprised if the Russians still find ways of continuing offensive action in various places during the Rasputitsa period, despite the widespread expectations that they will not do so. To repeat again a point I have made in the past, the Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles which Ukraine now increasingly relies upon are not well adapted to the conditions of the Rasputitsa. Whilst, if you read Jim Kinnair's books about Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, you realize that they are. Anyway, we will see. That, it seems to me, anyway, is the situation on the battlefronts today. Lots of information still pouring out of Avdeyevka, the Russians pushing west from Avdeyevka. We will see what the Russians plan. It's again striking how when the Ukrainians plan something, they talk about it incessantly. We learned weeks in advance in the summer of 2022 that they were preparing to conduct an offensive in Kherson region, for example. The summer offensive that Ukraine undertook last year was flagged up months in advance. The Russians, by contrast, maintain tight security, a complete information silence about what their long-term plans are. And the result is, and this is a point again I want to make, contrary to what many think, the result is that they achieve surprise. Now, there is a view, a very fashionable view, one promoted by none other than General Zelenskyy himself at one point, that because of the existence of satellite data and drones and all of those sort of things, it is impossible to take forces, the various armies, by surprise on the Ukrainian battlefield. But the Kharkiv counteroffensive that the Ukrainians rapidly put together in the autumn of 2022, and which did seem to me to have taken the Russians by surprise, and the Russian capture of Krasnogorovka in March of last year, and the entire way in which the Battle of Avdeyevka has been conducted refutes that. And of course, the Russians, their ability to keep silent about their plans keeps everybody guessing. Nobody knows what exactly it is that they are preparing to do, so that when it does happen, when they do attack in any particular direction, they will, as now regularly happens, take the Ukrainians by surprise. I'm just saying. Now, that brings me to the last point I'm going to make about military matters, which is a very senior Russian military officer, the operations chief of the General Staff, General Rudskoy, has now spoken. Now, he is General Gerasimov's number two. General Gerasimov is the overall Chief of the General Staff, General Rudskoy, who is the Operations Chief of the General Staff, is nominally, I think, number 2, and certainly he is the person who, as I said, with overall supervision of operations, he is somebody who keeps careful track of what is going on the battlefield and coordinates it and does a lot of the staff work. Now, he doesn't speak very often. I remember that he gave a very interesting statement in March 2022, explaining an awful lot about the way in which the Russians had conducted the early stages of the special military operation. It's always surprised me how little attention that statement gave, because, in fact, if you read it, you'd have learned an awful lot about what it was that the Russians were up to. General Rudskoy in that statement, for example, said that it had never been the Russian plan to storm Kiev or the other northern cities, that they were conducting a pinning operation in order to try to weaken Ukrainian positions in Donbass. It was a pinning operation which didn't fully succeed, as we subsequently know. But anyway, that was what General Rudskoy said. And anyway, he's come forward now, and he's provided an overview of the situation at the moment. And he did this in an interview with Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, the official newspaper of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And he said that the Ukrainian army, despite the severe knocks that it has suffered, retains combat capability. Rudskoy said it is not even completely excluded that they might at some point try an offensive somewhere. Now, as to the latter, I have to say I think that is unlikely, at least for the moment, given the state that the Ukrainian army is in. But I take General Rudskoy's words to mean that the Russian military leadership still feel that aggressive attrition has some way to go. The Ukrainians have suffered many blows. They've suffered severe losses, but there is still a lot to do. They still have viable formations. The Ukrainians still have viable formations. In other words, the Russians almost certainly do not intend to launch a big offensive over the next few weeks. They will continue attacking. They will continue taking places like Avdeyevka, possibly Casualties, conceivably Vuhledar, all of those things. But a big Russian offensive intended to knock out Ukraine in one single blow is still not imminent, though perhaps it's starting to draw closer over the horizon. Anyway, let's move on, because that's, as I said, what we know about the military situation in Ukraine as of today. The events in Avdeyevka have triggered shockwaves around the world, not least in the collective West. And we've had a fascinating article about this, and it's from the Financial Times. And it says, Russian victories shake global leaders' faith in Ukraine war prospects. Statespeople, diplomats, military brass and spies at a defense conference this weekend fear war is tilting in Moscow's favor. Now, before we proceed, I have to make a point which is about this title. Russian victories shake global leaders' faith in Ukraine's war prospect. Global leaders? It becomes immediately clear when you read the article that all of the leaders who have been talked about are the leaders of the West. The rest of the world is not shaken. Perhaps they're quietly pleased because some of them, at least, are quietly on the Russian side. And we've got another article in the Financial Times which tells us as much. It says that it speaks about, it's by Gideon Rachman, the strange loyalty of Putin's global fan club. Admirers of the Russian leader may soon lead the world's 3 largest democracies. And it speaks about the fact that Putin and Russia enjoy the friendship of India and of Indonesia, 2 of the biggest democracies. Prime Minister Modi of India makes no secret of his deep friendship, the strong economic links that he wishes to forge with Russia. And there's even a photograph in this article of Putin and Modi embracing. And as the article admits, Prabowo Subianto, the president of Indonesia, who has also, by the way, just been decisively re-elected in a presidential election in Indonesia last week. Anyway, he also is a friend of President Putin and has, if anything, tilted towards Russia. Gideon Rachman writes that last year, Prabowo proposed a peace settlement for Ukraine that was so accommodating to Putin's ambitions that it was dismissed by Ukraine as a Russian plan. Cornelius Purba, managing editor of the Jakarta Post, recently noted Prabowo's admiration for Putin and suggested that among the Indonesian electorate there are many who are supporters of the retired army general because they are fanatical fans of President Putin. So, if the Indonesians and the Indians and the other BRICS states and the Arab states, we saw this extraordinary welcome that President Putin was extended to President Putin when he visited Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates just a few weeks ago. If all of these countries are favorable to Putin and to Russia, if Brazil is a member of the BRICS, if South Africa is on excellent terms with Russia, well, how can we talk about global leaders being shaken by Russian victories and fearing that the war is tilting in Moscow's favor? Perhaps some global leaders, perhaps most of them, are actually pleased that it is tilting in Moscow's favor. I'm not saying they are, by the way. I suspect most of them still want a negotiated solution. But this constant habit, which you also see in the Western media, of assuming that Western leaders speak for the world, for the globe, is, again, it does no one any favors. And as we move one way or the other towards a more multipolar system, the sooner it ends, the better. But anyway, having made that point, we then go on to read things like this. 3 months ago, delegates at the Munich Security Conference radiated optimism. 12 months ago, delegates at the Munich Security Conference radiated optimism about the prospects for Ukraine as the West vowed to back Kiev in its war with Russia for as long as it takes. This year, with the conflict tilting in Moscow's favor and faith in Western support ebbing away, that optimism has flipped into unremitting gloom. The three-day gathering in Munich that concluded on Sunday was marked by recognition that Ukraine badly needed more weapons and ammunition, and that the rhetoric of solidarity must now be translated urgently into action. And then we're told about how all the various Ukrainian officials and Western officials were all in agreement about this, because the situation was becoming so bad and so difficult. And we're told that they were shocked, depressed by news of the death of Alexei Navalny. As I've said, the major reason for this shock, well, perhaps some of them were sorry for Navalny, but as I said, the major reason for this shock is that without Navalny, they can no longer cling convincingly to the fantasy that there is a pro-Western leader in Russia ready to take over from Putin. Fantasy, though, I want to stress, that always was. But anyway, they were shocked to learn about Navalny's death, but then the following day it was announced that Ukrainian forces had withdrawn from the critical eastern city of Avdeyevka, handing the Kremlin its first big battlefield win since its destruction and capture of Bakhmut last May. I mean, again, this is so full of false language, wrong language. As we said, Ukrainian forces didn't just withdraw from Bakhmut, the Russians captured Bakhmut, the Ukrainians were routed, and it is not the Kremlin's first battlefield win since Bakhmut last May. As I've already discussed, that this is simply wrong, and that it's absurd and a misrepresentation of the realities on the battlefield to continue to talk in that way. And then we're told that they're all worried about the possibility of Donald Trump being elected president. That's also adding to the gloom. And then we're told that prospects are darkening as Russia reconstitutes its army and has shifted to a war economy. Again, the talk about Russia being in a war economy situation shows a failure to understand what a war economy actually is. But there is a grudging admission expressed by Piotr Pavel, the Czech president and a former general, that Russia has learned a lot of lessons, and it's already also producing more ammunition and equipment than we can collectively provide, and that in fact there is really no prospect. And that is what the rest of the article appears to concede, that there is no prospect of the situation being turned round, because ammunition supplies, weapon supplies from the West simply cannot match current Russian production. And then we also go on to learn that there is an undercurrent of rancor, in other words, recriminations are starting to appear, a feeling that their countries, some leaders were bending over backwards for Ukraine, while others in Europe were not pulling their weight. And this comes from Denmark, and the Danes have announced that they're going to supply their remaining ammunition and artillery to Ukraine. The best comment about this that I've seen is made by Valterson. He asked the question, what artillery, what ammunition? I mean, Denmark never had that much to start with. They've already given away most of it to Ukraine, as most of the other European countries have. Giving away what's left, it's not going to make any difference. And Valterson makes the point that, some months ago, Estonia said that it was giving away its entire air force to Ukraine. The only problem with that was that Estonia had no air force to start with. These are just rhetorical poses, but they do expose the rancor and the recriminations that there are. But the key point to note is that even as there's the gloom and the recriminations, and even as we learn, and there's various sources that are now saying this, that Zelenskyy himself was in extremely bad way when he was in Munich. There's been some comments about him looking as if he's close to outright despair, despite him attending all of these parties and receptions and all of these things, with his wife also present. Well, despite all of that, the one thing that no one appears prepared to do or is prepared to discuss is to do the obvious and logical thing, which is talk to the Russians. Now, there's lots of debate about what that might achieve. Simplikius the thinker, for example, says that when Putin talks about the fact that Russia is open to negotiations, it's prepared to sit down and have unconditional discussions about the end of the war in Ukraine, about trying to find some way forward, that this is ultimately a pose. Putin knows perfectly well that the Ukrainians are not prepared to talk to him, that the Western powers aren't prepared to talk to him by appearing to be reasonable, to say that he's ready for negotiations. He undercuts and weakens the Western position, which is absolutely the case, by the way. As I think I mentioned in my program yesterday, the latest in the series, the next in the series of so-called peace summits that Jake Sullivan and the other Western leaders cobbled together last August, which was supposed to try to assemble an international consensus around Zelensky's peace plan. That has had to be postponed indefinitely because too few countries showed any further willingness to turn up. So undoubtedly, by Putin pretending that he's ready for talks, or saying that he's ready for talks, and the West insisting that the only basis for talks must be Zelensky's demands, that is undercutting the Western position in some extent. So perhaps all of this is a bluff, and it is opposed by Putin. But if it is a bluff and a pose, why not call it? What is lost? What is lost by making an approach to Moscow? Saying to the Russians, look, the situation is very bad, but ultimately, if you press on with this war, you will still suffer significant losses by doing so. And is it really in your interests and what you actually want to take over the whole of Ukraine? Cannot we not reach some kind of an understanding and an agreement which will at least preserve Ukraine and restore some kind of peace to Europe and might provide some kind of system of stability again? And of course, if Putin comes along and says no, or if talks begin but the Russians string them out, or of course, or alternatively, if the Russians make a series of extreme demands, well, then you'll have called their bluff. But no, That's not something Western leaders, Western governments are prepared to do. The Ukrainian government isn't, of course, prepared to do that either. The war must go on, even though every claim that has been made about it, the idea that Russia would not be able to sustain the war, that its economy would buckle under the sanctions, that there would be an economic collapse, well, that has failed. The regime change in Moscow idea has also collapsed. Without an economic collapse, it's difficult to see how that is possible. But with Prigozhin dead, and now with Navalny dead, even Western leaders surely cannot believe that regime change is any sort of possibility. And military defeat of the Russians, well, that's impossible too. In fact, there's been a great article about this in the Hill, and it's by Andrew Latham. He says the idea of total Ukrainian victory is delusional. And he goes on to say that in the book of Proverbs, chapter 26, there's an invaluable insight. As dogs return to their vomit, so fools repeat their folly. You see those who are wise in their own eyes. There is more hope for fools than for them. And doesn't this describe Western leaders exactly? And Latham, who has come up with this brilliant quote from the book of Proverbs, he says that the past few months have witnessed the dog returning to its vomit in the form of any number of efforts to once again make the case that Ukraine still has a path to victory in its war against Russia. In professional journals, influential websites, across the full spectrum of media outlets, observers, analysts, pundits alike continue to inform us that yes, there is a way for Ukraine to prevail over Russia, expelling the latter from all of its territory, including Crimea. And he then reads that one might claim that these arguments are being advanced because the facts on the ground warrant them, because the shifting geopolitical and battlefield realities clearly indicate that the military balance is tipping in Ukraine's favour. That as Ukraine acquires more weapons, more sophisticated weapons, it will inevitably achieve the kind of tactical advantages that will propel it first to operational and then to strategic breakthroughs, culminating in total victory. All that is required is one more mobilization of Ukrainian youth, one more tranche of Western financial aid, one more delivery of American, French, and British wonder weapons. And then he said that the strategic, operational, and tactical realities of the war simply don't support any version of this argument. Ukraine is not prevailing at the tactical level. Russia's advantage there is growing rather than diminishing as Russia outpaces Ukraine in adapting to the evolving realities of the battlefield. And Russia not only remains capable of sustaining the kind of defense in depth that has completely frustrated all Ukrainian offensive efforts, but is increasingly able to mount successful offensives in places like Avdeyevka. And in short, if Russia is winning the war, and there is little to suggest that any foreseeable political, economic, tactical, or technological developments are likely to alter that fundamental reality, why are we seeing arguments about an ultimate Ukrainian battlefield triumph in the face of all the devastatingly contradictory evidence? And then he goes into some psychological explanations to explain this delusional thinking, which I'm not going to return to. But then he says that, like the proverbial dog returning to his vomit, these observers who originally committed to the Ukraine will prevail thesis continue to return to their delusion, ever more manically expressed, that there is a pathway to total victory for Ukraine. But there isn't. And the sooner policymakers and influencers on both sides of the Atlantic grasp this, the sooner we can get to a negotiated cessation of hostilities that stems, at least for the moment, the obscene carnage that has come to define this war. Andrew Latham, I should say, is a professor of international relations at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and a non-resident fellow at Defense Priorities in Washington, D.C. And I have to say, it's one of the most sensible, rational, and humane articles about this war I have read since it began. Perhaps, as I said, the Russians are in no mood to compromise. If so, by the way, it wouldn't surprise me. We have thrown everything we have at them, and we have been doing it not just over the course of the last 2 years. We have been doing it for much longer. We've been trying constantly to engineer some kind of political crisis, even a regime change in Moscow. We have worked incessantly to peel off former Soviet republics from their friendships, their traditional ties with Moscow. We've played them false over the eastward extension of NATO. We've torn up arms control treaties like the ABM treaty. We're pressing forward with the introduction of anti-ballistic missile interceptors in Eastern Europe. We've sabotaged the Minsk agreement. I mean, by now, as Putin has made absolutely clear, the Russians have no trust in us at all, and why should they? But perhaps, possibly, just possibly, the Russians themselves, mindful of the international and global reaction, and also mindful of the very difficult realities in taking complete control of the whole of Ukraine, discussed with great insight by people like Eve Smith and John Mearsheimer from different perspectives, hers economic, his what you might call political and geopolitical. Well, perhaps the Russians, knowing all of that and wanting a stable situation, at least for a time, on their western borders, might conclude that perhaps some kind of a deal can be done and should be done. No, that's not what people in the West are prepared to do. Go on fighting. President Putin looks more secure in his position than he did at the start of the special military operation when all those sanctions were imposed. The Russian economy looks in a better situation than it did when the sanctions were imposed. There's been an absolutely fascinating report by Elvira Nabiullina, the chairman of the Russian Central Bank. She's still concerned about inflation. She says that inflation in Russia is indeed starting to fall. She feels that the economic, the period of overheating in the Russian economy that we saw last year, that's starting to subside. It will result in lower economic growth this year than last year, but that economic growth will be at a more sustainable level. But she also pointed out that investment remains high and that even the central bank, the most cautious and conservative of all Russian economic institutions, is now coming round to the view that Russia's room for economic expansion is widening, that the future growth prospects of the Russian economy are greater than was the case 2 years ago. And of course, as we've seen in terms of military production, strength of the armed forces, the Russians are getting stronger all the time. as Gordon Hahn recently said in a piece that he wrote on his blog post, at the end of this conflict, the Russians will have the most modern, the most battle-tested, the most efficient, and the most powerful military in the world. So, continue to reinforce failure, support Ukraine to the point where it ceases to exist, keep pressing the Russians in a way that makes them more popular and yourself less popular, make the Russians richer and stronger, and see Ukraine itself destroyed, and what is left of Ukraine, this unhappy, tormented country, sacrificed to what end? Well, Andrew Latham, it seemed to me, described the symptoms of the disease, this Western obsession with keeping the war going, even as it is being lost, with great accuracy. It's difficult to come up with any rational explanation for it, but there it is. It looks like the Ukrainian people, because they are the greatest victims in this matter, are going to be forced by their Western allies to drink this cup of poison through to its bitter dregs. Well, this is where I finish my video for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget that you can also check out our shop, where you can see the amazing things that you can find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all these great things. I should say that we're in the process of rethinking and expanding and developing our shop, and we have many plans for it in the future, so keep aware of what might be coming there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.